Joni, I quickly fell in love with Joni, and we quickly connected. And she's helped me. She's been a key component in me being sober, getting sober, and staying sober. She's not one of those counselors that talk to you once a month. Out of the hair, blue, whatever. She'll text you, hey, what's going on? How you doing? Thinking about you, or a Facebook message, or whatever. She's there. She's a friend, and she's not just there for the money. She cares. So anyway, we have a weird relationship, but it works. But Joni is most passionate about recovery and healing from all manifestations of eating disorders and other addictions. She's married for 28 years, and she's the mother of 2 grown sons, and she has 2 grandchildren. And Joni's been sober from alcohol and amphetamines for 30 years. And she's been abstinent from bulimia, anorexia, binge eating, emotional eating, and that's for a combined 30 years. So she had a 1-year relapse 18 years ago, but she's honored to be called to serve. And we're glad that she's here, and Jack too, we're glad he can come along for the ride. He reminds me of a big teddy bear. Anyway, Joni, it's all yours.
What it was like. My dad was a refinery worker. I grew up in a family. I was a middle child, and he was a workaholic. He was a Cajun cowboy. Had a really, really cool attitude. Real, just love people. And I noticed the whole time I grew up, I never felt comfortable in my skin. I never felt, I didn't have any self-worth. There's a lot of different reasons for that. But I really, really struggled on the inside, but on the outside, you'd have never known. I grew up in a Baptist church, and I've said before that I believe my first addiction was codependency. And while growing up in this Baptist church, I'm not real sure what the minister was preaching, but what I heard was a lot of hell and damnation. I was going to burn in hell and just a lot of things like that. And so I was scared of God. And so I did a lot of stuff to keep myself separate. And when I say codependency was my first addiction, I think my second addiction was the misuse of food. I'm from a Cajun family, and that's one of our love languages. You walk in the door and somebody's going to try to feed you. And so I do believe that I was born with that little mechanism that told me when to stop eating, and I think that I ate past it for so long that I couldn't hear it anymore. I couldn't sense it anymore. And so coupled with that, my dad had a restaurant, and so I worked there, and so I had access to free food 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it was a very, very unhealthy relationship. I've looked back on pictures of myself, and I was not overweight when I was in elementary school. But one of the things I realized through my journey of healing is that my mother, and please don't hear me say I'm blaming my mother for any of this, because I'm not. We've talked about a lot of it. My mother raised me through the lens of her own eating disorder. And so as a result of that, I adopted a lot of ideas about me that just weren't true. And So couple that with, everything that I talked about before, it was kind of a recipe for disaster. As far as me and my relationship, I always felt uncomfortable in my skin, in my body, because I viewed myself as always being overweight. And like I said, I've looked back on pictures of myself and I wasn't out of the norm for the other little kids of my age. So I started drinking alcohol when I was 12. I started drinking and driving when I was 13. For some strange reason, my dad gave me a truck when I was 13 years old and turned me loose in the small town I grew up in, and I had access to free, unlimited gasoline. And so I got a little bit older, and I started playing around with amphetamines to lose weight. And so I absolutely loved the way they made me feel. And so I went through high school. My parents ended up divorced. My dad was having an affair on my mother with another woman. And because my parents were involved in their own lives, there wasn't anybody watching us. So I'm a middle child. I have an older brother and a younger sister. And I ended up getting pregnant at 16 years old. My mom, for some reason, let my boyfriend move in with us. And I got pregnant, which is not a surprise, but back in the early 80s, that wasn't as accepted as it is today, and I was very ashamed of that. I was actually a cheerleader at the time, and the only thing I noticed is that my skirt was a little tight. So I went to cheer at a football game. Next morning, my boyfriend at the time drove me to Shreveport, Louisiana to have an abortion. I had an abortion scheduled, actually on my 16th birthday. And the doctor walked in and he said, "You're too far along, we can't perform this." I was 6.5 months pregnant. And he said, "You're too far along." And so we went back over to my boyfriend's parents' house. He lived in Shreveport. And so I called my mom and let her know that I was pregnant. And she said, "I think you need to come home." She said, "I think you need a hug." So we drove home. And a couple of days later, that hug turned to her calling me a bitch and a whore and a slut. Very, very, very angry. So she goes over and I had asked her not to tell my dad because I was scared of my dad. And come to find out that was the biggest blessing in my life. He asked me what I wanted to do, and I told him I wanted to have an abortion. So he scheduled, I didn't tell him any of the other stuff. So he scheduled an appointment in Houston, and his business partner's wife drove me to Houston, and of course they said the same thing. I was 6.5 months pregnant, they're not gonna do an abortion on that. And so, because of the shame that I carried, I told my dad that I wanted to give the baby up for adoption. So he drove up to the Edna Gladney home in Fort Worth. It's the only time I've ever seen my dad cry is when he dropped me off at the Edna Gladney home. It's an abortion agency for unwed teenagers. And he just told me, "Don't sign anything." He didn't want me to sign anything. They wanted you to sign the papers to surrender the baby when you got there, and he just told me not to sign anything. So I lived there for 2.5 months. Changed my mind I don't know when I changed my mind, but I called him on a Sunday evening and I said, "Dad, I changed my mind." And he flew up there and got me the next day. And so that stay was about $65,000 because he had to pay all the cost. And so I came home a couple of days before Christmas, and I was very ashamed of myself. And he looked at me and he said, "Joni, this is the greatest Christmas present I could ever have." This is my first grandchild. And so when Tanya read earlier about that I'm the mother of 2 adult sons, I have a 42-year-old son. That's a son that I was just talking about. And he and I had, we just now reconnected about 2 years ago. We had a 14-year estrangement, and God saw fit to bring us back together. So we've been back together for 2 years. And when she read that I have 2 grandchildren, I actually have 2 grandchildren and I've not met them yet. So I have a 15-year-old grandson named Colt and a 13-year-old granddaughter named Brinley. And my son really wanted me to meet him a couple of years ago when we got back together, and I told him I thought we ought to wait till the divorce was over because his wife doesn't like me or my family or any of that. So, yeah. So God restores. There are things that go on in my life that in my best effort, I couldn't create. There is a power greater than me. So I'm going to fast forward. I went to treatment in 1992. And when I went to treatment, my primary diagnosis was bulimia. I was severely bulimic for about 16 years. And in that, I was anorexic. I've done everything misusing food that you can do, to be honest. I've eaten food out of the garbage. I've eaten food that was burnt. I had an addiction crawling on my back that led me to do things that I'm not proud to stand up here and talk about. I also drank. Like I said, I started drinking really early. And so when I went to treatment in 92, they told me, if you don't stop drinking, you're not going to recover from your eating disorder. And for whatever reason, I believed them. Because I've always been a know-it-all. I've always been a know-it-all, and I didn't like to take direction from anybody. And when they told me that, for whatever reason, I listened. Because I had that craving crawling on my back. I could not figure out where that appetite for excess food came from, and it drove me. It absolutely drove me. So I knew 32 years ago what I wanted to do with my life, because I felt like the counselor in that treatment program was the first person that ever listened to me, heard me, and understood. Her story and my story were similar. And this is back when we had paper charts, because I am a therapist today, but we have all electronic stuff. But back then we had paper charts, and she said, Joni, you could take your chart and put my name over the tab, and you wouldn't know any different. So I was real grateful for that, because I felt like I was connected to somebody for the first time in my life. And that was so important, because the treatment center that I went to, I was in treatment with a bunch of alcoholics and addicts. I was the only person in there with an eating disorder, because back then, eating disorders fell under a particular license, and what's called an LCDC license. And I was the only person in there with an eating disorder, so they literally had to call an alumni to come in to talk to me so that I could feel connected to someone other than the counselor. I remember they got me to read the 12 steps. Like, I went to my first AA meeting my first day there, and I was so lost. Like, I just couldn't understand. And at that point, I had not recognized that I had a problem with alcohol. I just had fun. That's how I always looked at it, is I loved to go out and have fun. So, fast forward, I was introduced to steps. I was introduced to a lot of tools that could be of service to me in my recovery, and I didn't do any of it, except go to meetings, and I found a sponsor. But all I wanted the sponsor for was so I could complain about what my husband was not doing. Not this one. This is a different one. I was married before. And God knew what kind of sponsor that I needed, a strong, wise, spiritual woman that held my feet to the fire. And she said, if we're going to work together, we have to work the steps. And so for whatever reason, eventually I broke because I heard what you were saying a while ago, and eventually that's what happened is I broke, and I recognized my powerlessness. I had tried everything in my own willpower to get to make myself stop doing what I was doing, and I couldn't do it. And so I had relapsed, gone out, got drunk. I was walking up the steps of the local AA hall, and this old guy named Chuck L., he just died about a year ago. He was one of the men God put in my life to help save my life. So I'm walking up the steps, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, Joni, have you had enough yet?" And I thought, oh my gosh. And so I truly believe that that's when my recovery started, is once I admitted my powerlessness. I love this, the 12 steps and the biblical comparisons. So anyway, today, I'm a licensed professional counselor, an LPC, I'm a therapist. I'm an LCDC, I'm a licensed chemical dependency counselor. I'm an adjunct professor at a local community college. I do intensive weekend retreats and wellness weekends, and everything that I have good in my life today is because of my recovery. And everything that I have good in my life today is because of the power of God. Amen. Of tapping into that. So this is my husband, Jay. This is my third husband. One of the things that I learned when I was going to graduate school, we had to do what's called I can't remember what it's called, but we had to list like our lineage of our families. And so I had to list like my mom, my dad, addictions, mental illness, divorces, and all of that stuff. And one of the things I realized is just up to my grandparents, there were 26 divorces. And I thought, no wonder I didn't know anything about commitment. And again, I'm not blaming them. But I didn't know anything. I had always been a runner. I'm out of here. And that's what I did. So my college education was very important to my father. My dad had dropped out of high school in his junior year. His father died, and so he dropped out of school. And so with me being having a baby in high school, he knew that I didn't need to be able to take care of myself. So my education was real important to him, formal education. And so it took me 25 years to get an associate's degree. Y'all know this associate's degree is a 2-year degree. It took me 25 years. And what I can tell you is when I did graduate with that 2-year degree at Lamar State College, Port Arthur, they used to call it LUPA, Lamar University, Port Arthur. I graduated on a Friday night and my dad died Sunday morning. And I know that man was waiting for me to walk across that stage. So I turned around and started Lamar Beaumont in January of that very next year because I know me. And I knew that if I didn't continue with my education that I would never go back. And so even though my dad had just died a couple of weeks before, I still enrolled in school. And what I realized is the reason that it took me 25 years is because of fear. I had so much fear. I had so much fear about the big school. Lamar University in Beaumont was always considered the big school to me. And what had happened at the time is Hurricane Rita had hit our area. And so we couldn't go home for about 3.5 weeks. And so we kind of traveled around Texas. My husband and I have a 28-year-old. And so we traveled around Texas and we cried and we prayed. Well, maybe I cried. Cried and prayed and talked. Cried and prayed and talked. Cried and prayed and talked. And we decided to get our formal educations finished together. And so the reason that I was able to get to Lamar and Beaumont to the big school is because he was already there. And y'all, he held my hand and walked me to class the first couple of weeks of class because I had so much fear. Do you remember that? So it only took me 1.5 years to get my bachelor's degree because I had so many hours. And so we moved to Montgomery. We live up on Lake Comeaux in Montgomery. And we moved to Montgomery about 14 years ago. When we moved over there, I thought I was going to be a school teacher. Because I was telling him about, I wanted a job where I could be off all summer. And he said, you know, babe, there's a job out there that you can do that you don't have to be so excited about how much time you get off. And so when we moved over there and I was looking for a job, that was the year the Texas legislators had slashed the education budget. And no school districts were hiring. Because I said, how do you get on around here? And they said, substitute and volunteer. So I'm a substitute and volunteering fool, and nobody hired me. Plan B. Well, I had taken all these substance abuse counseling classes at Lamar Port Arthur as part of my 25-year history. And so I started gathering information about getting my LCDC license because I've always been engaged in recovery. Because one of my professors at Lamar Port Arthur, when I was taking substance abuse counseling classes, said, Joni, we're only as effective as counselors as our own issues we've worked through. And I thought, holy cow. So I spent a lot of time doing my own digging and my own healing and working the steps and being of service because I didn't want to take a chance of any of my stuff getting off on who I was working with. I didn't want to project. There's something called countertransference. I didn't want to take a chance of any of that. So, living in Montgomery, I started gathering information about getting my LCDC license. And I had to drive over to Lee College because I needed one practicum class. And I didn't know anything about Lone Star College. Lone Star College is not that far from my house. I didn't know anything about it. So I drive about 2 hours every Tuesday to Lee College, and I met this old crusty alcoholic. His name was Howard Bushart. And for whatever reason, Mr. Bushart let me in that program just to take that one class because I told him I was going to continue and get my graduate degree. And for whatever reason, that man trusted me. I know that God put that man in my life. So I got that practicum class finished. Was working at the Right Step in the Woodlands. About 6 months in, I realized that wasn't my cup of tea, insurance-funded treatment. And so I had an interview at Centacor Foundation at the Henley facility in Dayton. And one of the LCDC said, Joni, I wouldn't even show up for that job interview. He said, that's a prison job. He said, you're not gonna like that. And y'all, I rolled up to the Henley facility. And when I got out of my car, the tears just started coming. I thought, okay, God, this is where I was supposed to be. And I thought, this program director is either going to think I'm crazy or she's going to understand. And so I've spent quite a bit of my work time working in prison. I don't know why I'm so passionate about prison work. The depths that addiction brings people. And I used to tell the women, I'd say, the only difference between you and I is that you got caught. I've driven drunk a lot from Beaumont to Port Arthur. All the clubs that I like to hang out with were in Beaumont. I drove drunk a lot. I just never got caught. And so I'm very, very passionate about prison treatment work. I still am. So I go through, I spent some time at men's facilities as well because I wanted to have a balance with what I was doing. But through all this, I've always kept my finger on the pulse of my own recovery. I've always had to keep my own recovery separate from my work. Because in my experience at times, I've run into counselors who are in recovery, and they stop going to meetings, and they stop working the steps, and they stop doing what got them sober in the first place, and then it can become unhealthy. So, spent time, and I knew, y'all, the minute I walked onto a prison unit, I thought, I want to be a program director. I'm going to be a program director. So I got fully licensed. I left out of prison work because I want to see what's out in the world that I could do with my license, and I got a job, and it really wasn't satisfying. So I called my old supervisor in Austin, and I said, from prison work, and I said, hey, I said, what do I have to do to get myself ready to be a program director? And she said, what? And I said, what do I need to do to get myself ready to be a program director? And she said, Joni, you're already ready. I couldn't get off the phone with her fast enough, because what had happened is it triggered a distorted belief that I've carried around with me since I probably walked out of my mother's womb, that I'm not good enough. I couldn't get off the phone fast enough with her. So about 8 months later, I called her back. I said, hey, Heather, it's Joni. I said, what are the qualifications to be a program director? She said, you know, it's funny you asked. The program director position at the Hamilton unit is open, which is where I used to work. So I called my old warden. I said, hey, warden, it's Miss Comeaux. And he said, what are you doing, Miss Comeaux? I said, I'm thinking about applying to be program director. Excuse my language. Do you mind if I say a cuss word? He said, get your ass down here. So I'm going to apply for this job. And then I'm looking at the minimum qualifications. I don't have 6 years counseling experience. So I called Warden Lewis back and I said, Warden, I'm not going to be able to apply for this job after all. And he said, how come? And I said, because I don't have 6 years counseling experience. And he said, get your ASS down here and talk to Miss Boyd, the human resource lady. So I filled out my application, printed it out, made an appointment, talked to Miss Boyd. So she's looking over my application and she said, Miss Comeaux, what are you talking about? She said, you have 20 years supervisory experience. So y'all, this is how powerful, I call them distorted beliefs. That distorted belief that I was not good enough, that has been with me since I came out of my mother's womb, probably after. I don't personally believe I was born that way. That distorted belief that I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I didn't even see on the minimum qualifications that I needed to have either 6 years counseling experience or 6 years supervisory experience. That's how powerful that distorted belief was. And Ms. Boyd said, of course you're qualified for this. Now the thing about it is, in my experience, on one hand, I knew what God was calling me to do. My responsibility is to take the action. But when you have a calling, when I have a calling in my life, but I also have distorted beliefs running below my level of consciousness, you see where yeah. So I go to the job interview, sit down in front of Warden Lewis and Heather, my past supervisor from Austin, and he asked me a question. I froze. Y'all know what trauma responses are? Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. I froze. And Warden said, well, Miss Comeaux, I said, hang on a minute, I'm nervous. And he said, don't bail on me now. Fast forward, I got the job. Walking down the slab to my office every day. And guess what that voice sounded like in my mind? They're gonna find out you don't know what you're doing. Who do you think you are? Come on. I'm the kind of person, y'all, I like to time stuff. I I like to time stuff. It took 6 weeks for me getting up and going and doing my job every day before I literally retrained my brain. Retraining our brain is simple. It's not always easy. But I took the action every day of where I felt like God was leading me, and after 6 weeks, that thinking stopped. Does that make sense? Had a wonderful career with TDCJ, got fully licensed, left again. I've spent time working with sex offenders. I wanted to connect with people and learn about how someone can commit the most heinous crimes on the planet. The program director at the time was an expert, and I wanted to learn. I'm the kind of person I like to get in there and learn. I don't want to know what a book says. I want to look in the face of a sex offender and say, and get to the root of where this came from in the first place. Because I always felt like my time in prison that I was part of the solution. And I felt like I was being of service, because I believe God provided me a gift to see beyond and be able to connect with that person in a heart-to-heart way so that they would trust me enough to let me in. Because they're going to be paroled, and these could be our next-door neighbors. Yeah. So, spent time working at our Roadway to Freedom program. It was a prostitution program at Plain State Jail. I can tell you that for whatever reason, the healing that God has provided for me has provided gifts to me to be of service to His people. That's why I always say yes to things like this. God has healed me to be of service to other people. That's not to say I'm healed and whole and perfect. I was really irritated when I got on the road to come over here today. Nothing to do with this. We have a hole in our roof from the whatever, and the guy came out to look at it. Right when he was fixing to look at it, he got a call and some emergency and had to leave. So all I know is I have a hole in my roof. So, because that's one of the antidotes for me, is to be of service and get out of myself. Because one of the things that I learned a long time ago, and I'm very grateful that God still makes sure that I circle back around and I remember, selfishness and self-centeredness is the root of my problem. Selfishness and self-centeredness is the root of my problem. My responsibility is to get out of me, and be of service. So, with that being said, spent some time, several years working at sex offender treatment, both male and female. Left out of there and went into private practice. Somewhere along the way, when I said a while ago that there are things that happen in my life that even on my best day I could not create. I get to teach at Lone Star College. Lone Star College is in the Woodlands. I teach future LCDCs, and I have people, I've been doing it for 6 years, and I have people that ask me, oh my gosh, how'd you get on at Lone Star College? I've been sending them my resume for a little over a year and they don't even acknowledge, and I'm like, I got a private message on Facebook asking me to apply. I didn't even interview for the job. You know how I got connected with my supervisor? Being of service. Being of service and going and speaking to his class, to the people that are going to school for what I'm going to school for. That's how I got that job. God put me in the right place at the right time. Now, I'm going to sit here and say that God does this for me, God does that for me, and God does all these things for me, like I just kind of flow along with it. The hardest step for me to work is the third step, and I'm talking 12 steps. I don't know what the corresponding. Consciously chose to commit all my life and will to Christ's care and control. I'm a do-it-yourselfer. I don't like to ask for help. And the third step has been one of the hardest steps that I've had to work. And because I don't like to ask for help. And I'm grateful that God is merciful. I'm grateful that he knows these things about me. So, circle back around to everything that's good in my life. Like I said a while ago, my husband, this is my third husband. I have not found it necessary to file for divorce since I've been sober. I met him, do you mind if I share this? I met him in Alcoholics Anonymous about 30 years ago. We started dating, we had about 2 years sobriety each, and we thought we knew what the heck was going on. We really didn't. I didn't, I'll speak for me. As a result of our union, we have a 28-year-old son. I can tell you that Alateen, do y'all have any corresponding Celebrate Recovery for teenagers?
There's a program that we haven't started yet.
Okay.
It's on the landing.
Okay, cool, I love that. So our son is a product of Alateen. When he was 12, he's cutting up at school, and the assistant principal's calling, because he's cutting up. So I drug him to his first Alateen meeting, and then after that, he'd say, hey, when's the next meeting? When's the next meeting? When's the next meeting? So he went to a lot of Alateen. Today, he's 28. He just turned 28 last weekend. Eating disorders have ravaged my family for generations back. I'm not the only one in my family with an eating disorder. My sister, I have a younger sister. I'm not breaking her anonymity. She lives nowhere around here. She's bulimic as well. I have an older brother that's 2 years older than me. He's a binge eater and has struggled, admittedly. My dad was a binge eater. My mom was anorexic. My great-grandmother, I have a picture of her in my office because she was one of my inspirations way back in the day. And please don't hear me say I'm diagnosing a deceased person because I'm not supposed to do that. Back in the day with my great-grandmother, she was diabetic. And from the information I've heard, she was a binge eater and really struggled with that and emotional eating to the point with her diabetes, they had to amputate both of her legs above the knee because she couldn't control her food. Fast forward, our son, his name is Lennon. When he was 13 years old, my mother-in-law died unexpectedly, my husband's mother. That was my son's favorite person on the planet. And from the age of 13 to 19, he got up to 450 pounds. It was very painful observing him basically kill himself with excess food upstairs in his room. I offered him what I had to offer. I wasn't a therapist or anything at the time, which I wouldn't have been his therapist anyway. I'm his mother. And we brought him to counseling, and she keeps talking to him about diet and exercise. And finally I went in there with him and I said, ma'am, if diet and exercise were the answer, we wouldn't be here. And I shared a little bit of information with her, and she said, you know more about that than I do. And all I knew was from Overeaters Anonymous. That's the information that I was drawing from. She said, you know more than I do. She said, all I know is what I read in a book. And I said, okay, well, I think our time here is done. So he graduates high school and he moves off to Nacogdoches with his friends because that was one of the things I worried about with him being, I don't know if he would be considered obese or morbidly obese at 450 pounds. I always worried about him having friends and fitting in and things like that. And my best friend Dina, well, she's actually my sponsor. She told me, she said, Joni, God's gonna put friends in his life that love him for who he is. And that's exactly what happened. So he graduates high school. Am I still good on time? Okay. So he graduates high school and moves to Nacogdoches with his two best friends. They live across the street from Stephen F. Austin State University. And only one of them was in school, but they all three live together. He's paying his own bills, and they all deliver pizza for Papa John's. And so one night on a Tuesday night, I get a phone call about 11:30 from his best friend's phone. And he said, hey Mom, I'm okay. And so moms, I'm sure you know, if you get a phone call like that, that means that there's something wrong. And so what had happened is he was delivering pizza that night, and was robbed. It was an aggravated robbery. They stuck 2 guns in his face. They stole his money. They stole his cell phone, and he was calling me from his best friend's phone. So I'm working in prison at the time, a male prison, and I walked into my group, and I said, how many of y'all have committed aggravated robbery? I said, come over here. And I cried. I said, this is the other side of it. And I told her what had happened the night before to my son. And I said, if this is what you're out there doing, stop. Stop. So he later told me, not too long ago, he's 28 now? That was when he was 19, so he's 28 now. He told me not too long ago, he said, Mom, did I tell you how much I was drinking after I got robbed? And I said, no, thank God. So he went about a month and then literally decided to flip the script. He lost a good 50 pounds and didn't tell us about it, so we drove up to Nacogdoches to see him and saw that he was on this weight loss journey. And he did it on his own. He did it his own way. And he ended up, a couple of months later, he said, can I move back home? You and Dad pay my car note, my insurance, and my gas, feed me, and let me live there for a year so I can continue to get my body ready for the Navy. Y'all, he earned a spot in Special Ops as a rescue swimmer. Yeah, and he did that. He did it his way, and he did it on his own. We just went and saw him in Pittsburgh last weekend. It was his 28th birthday. He's in school at Carnegie Mellon University for the Navy. There's a new rate. A rate in the Navy is a job, and it's for artificial intelligence and robotics. And they chose 5 sailors out of the whole Navy to send to this school, and he was one of them. And when the school's over, they're going to interview each of them to see if the Navy should purchase this curriculum from Carnegie Mellon University for their new rate. And he is just thriving. And Jay, my husband and I were talking about him on the way over here. Y'all, the thing about it is we're a family in recovery. I can't say that he still goes to meetings today because I doubt very seriously if he does. But we're a family in recovery, and these are the blessings that God has provided us in recovery, as a family in recovery. My husband and I are both still actively engaged. I do Alcoholics Anonymous to be of service to other women, and I do what's called an Enlightened Eating Group, and it's based on Eating Disorders Anonymous and Overeaters Anonymous and therapy. It's kind of a little blend of all that. Because I know how incredibly important it is for me to stay out of here. This thing right here will drag me down a rabbit hole in a heartbeat. I have a lot to be grateful for. And when we were first leaving the office to come over here, I was so irritable. I wanted to claw somebody's eyeballs out. And then I remembered, because God planted the seed in my mind, Joni, you're here to be of service. And then we had a pleasant, because we had a 2.5-hour drive to get here. So, yeah. So, I guess at this point, do y'all have any questions that I could answer? One of the things I can tell you is I have done a whole lot of trauma work. I provide that work, that healing to people, and I had a whole lot of trauma work myself in the beginning. I am a therapist. I don't use the word trauma very often because it's tossed around like confetti in my field, and it leaves a lot out. And so, it's one of those things of recognizing when I was working and being guided toward healing, what continued to drive addictions and eating disorders and things like that, I had to get down. In the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it talks about getting down to causes and conditions. I have continually had to get down to causes and conditions, and I guess with this environment, I'll be available afterwards. I think we're going to break apart for some small groups in just a little bit, and then I'll be here after, because I'm going to be honest with y'all. I love my recovery, and I love 12 steps, but if it weren't for extra outside work, I probably wouldn't be here. So, it was just something that was real important to me. So that's what I'll do, is I'll make myself available if I can be of service to anybody in any way. So that's my 10 minutes. Good. So I want to tell you, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to breaking off in these small groups, and I'm honored to be your friend. Thank you for having me.